All right, welcome back from break on the Heart of Sports. With the 149th Kentucky Derby being held this weekend, it is great to be joined by award-winning reporter, Canadian Horse Racing Hall of Fame member, and author of the new book, The Turcottes, The Remarkable Story of a Horse Racing Dynasty, Curtis Stock. Thank you so much for giving us some time.
Well, thanks for having me on, Jason. Appreciate it.
This is kind of like your Super Bowl this weekend. You got the Derby going on. It looks like you timed this book well. I think I read it was 20 years in the making for you, but talk about how it came about now and what the process was putting it together.
Well, I thought about writing it 20 years ago, but when I was working at the Journal in Edmonton, I found it too hard to write the book and work at the same time. But then when COVID hit, I said, I've got no more excuses not to write it. And I really did want to get it out in 2023 because it actually, your timing of your interview is perfect because it's exactly 50 years ago to the day that Secretariat won the Kentucky Derby.
So tell us a little bit about what the inspiration was for writing it. You said that it was 20 years in the making, but what was your inspiration for choosing this subject?
Well, it's just such a fascinating story of how five brothers from a lumberjack family in a small town in New Brunswick, Drummond, which has a population of 700, went on to become thoroughbred jockeys, and not just thoroughbred jockeys, but very good thoroughbred jockeys, especially Ron with Secretariat, but Rudy wasn't far behind. And it's a good story. And fortunately, there's a lot of tragedy that also happens to the family in addition to the triumphs.
There were 14 children. You actually spent some time with members of the Turcotte family prepping and interviewing for this book. Talk about what that was like for them to relive their life and experience building up the legacy that they did as a family.
They were all very good in sharing their stories. Unfortunately, Noel and Roger both took their own lives before I could talk to them again, but I did spend time with them before while they were alive, especially Roger. Roger rode in Alberta, and so did Eves. And Ron, I went and spent 3 days with him in New Brunswick, but I had talked to him hundreds of times throughout the course of the book.
So, sorry about that, Jeff. So tell me about Ron real fast, because you mentioned him. How did Ron go from arriving nearly penniless and picking worms and angling for a few bucks to a jockey on the most famous horse that we're still celebrating 50 years later?
Yeah, it was completely by accident that he got into horse racing. He wanted a better life and he wanted to get out of the woods in New Brunswick. So him and his good friend Reg Pelche went to Toronto and went looking for jobs. And as you mentioned, they found the only thing they could find is picking worms at cemeteries and getting $3 for 1,000 worms. They were broke. They were going to go back to New Brunswick. And on the first Saturday in May, Ron came down the steps of the boarding house that he was living in, and the landlord happened to be watching the Kentucky Derby. And Ron said, "What's that?" And the landlord said, "The Kentucky Derby." And Ron said, "Sir, I don't know anything about that." And he said, "Well, you can't get jobs here. Maybe that's what you should be doing. You should be a jockey." And Ron said, "What's a jockey?" And the landlord said, "The little guys in the white pants." Within 2 years, he was Canada's leading rider.
You talk about the fact that it's not just one, that there's a whole family that's involved in this. What was the dynamic among the brothers being involved with this? Were they ultra competitive with each other? Were they supportive of each other? Exactly what was that dynamic like for them?
Well, they were very competitive with each other, but they also were very much a family. Ron showed Noel how to ride. He showed Rudy how to ride. And he paved the way for the other two riders to come to the racetracks too. So they help each other out, especially Ron. Ron was always there to guide a guiding hand or give a guiding hand. And they're a family, but they rode together in some races, so they were also very competitive.
So this story's kind of in a few parts. It's the family and the dynasty. It's the horse. So let's go to Secretariat for a little bit. One one of the things you learned writing the book is just how good Secretariat was. He won the Kentucky Derby by 31 lengths. For people who don't know, that's a football field. That
Yeah, the Belmont.
his records still stand for the
Yeah.
Derby, the Belmont, and the Preakness 50 years later. Talk to us about the dominance of this horse, but also the impact that he had that 50 years later you are still celebrating him.
He was the greatest thoroughbred of all time. There's no question about it. He did lose some races, but none of the losses were his fault or the Secretariat's fault. He raced with a fever of 104 once, and Ron had begged him not to run him. He had an abscess in his lip the size of a quarter in the Wood Memorial, the race before the Kentucky Derby, and Ron couldn't get the horse to relax at all because of the abscess. And then he lost the Wood Memorial because he wasn't ready to run in that race. They were going to ride, they were going to run Riva Ridge, who had won the Derby and the Belmont the year before in 1972, but the track came up sloppy, and Riva Ridge couldn't stand up in the slop, so they put in Secretariat unprepared to race, and then he lost that one, and he also lost his first start when an apprentice rode him and got him into all sorts of trouble. So the horse should have been undefeated. And Ron says that we never saw the best of Secretariat, that he was just getting good when he was retired.
We always look at horse racing as the horse, but it's also a lot about the jockey. How did Ron and Secretariat get teamed up?
Uh, the trainer was Lucien Laurent, who was also a French Canadian trainer. So Ron and Lucien knew each other going back, and Lucien gave him the mount on Secretariat.
So I'm curious about how things have changed over time. The Kentucky Derby was Secretariat's 13th career race. And in this year's Derby field of 20 horses, none's raced more than 8 times. Secretariat raced 9 times as a 2-year-old. You don't see 2-year-olds race that much anymore. Can you talk about how horse racing has changed and the amount of work and experience these horses get?
Well, you're right. The horses don't run as often as they used to. They're giving more and more. They're getting rested. Some of the horses in Saturday's Kentucky Derby didn't even run as 2-year-olds. Some have as few as 3 starts. But it's interesting to note that the Secretariat influence is in the bloodlines of 8 of the 20 horses that are in the Derby, including the favorite Forte.
One of the things that I found interesting in the book was the toll that horse racing takes. We've heard so much about the toll that it takes on horses and how, where their careers go after races like this. But I was interested in the toll that it's taken on jockeys. What made you interested, and what did you learn most from looking into the toll that horse racing takes on jockeys?
Well, they're all forced to wage the battle of the bulge, and they have to be light to be jockeys. Ron was 128 pounds when he came to the track, and they told him he needed to be 108. He's weighed as much as 145 pounds when he was in grade 12, and he got down to 110. They live their lives in saunas and sweat boxes. They have to watch what they eat. They'll get in their cars, put layers and layers of clothing on, and turn the heat up as high as it'll go, and just sweat. And they take diuretics like Lasix to lose water. They obviously have to watch what they eat. They can't eat very much, and many jockeys are bulimic and purge. So it's a very tough life.
We talk about the highs of the Turcotte family, the success they had. They won over 8,200 races. They won purses just shy of $60 million. But the lows of the Turcottes and the tragedies come through in the book. The book starts with the family losing their home in a fire. It goes through the tragedies from Ron being paralyzed from the waist down to, you mentioned, some taking their lives, the alcoholism. Talk to us about the tragedies and the challenges this family faced.
Well, as you mentioned, they had several tragedies. Ron broke his back in 1978 in New York in a race where he clipped heels with a horse just to the outside of him. The horse kept coming closer and closer to him, and they clipped heels and he went down. And like you say, he's now paralyzed from the waist down and lives in a wheelchair. Rudy was an excellent rider, and Ron said he was probably a better rider than he was, but he couldn't get his weight down toward the end of his career either. Roger, he had troubles with the weight and alcohol, and Noel was the same way. And unfortunately, Noel and Roger both took their own lives. Yves was the last of the Turcotte brothers to ride, and he was involved in a spill somewhat similar to what Ron went through. And he went down in a spill and fractured his skull and had 3 brain bleeds, and he was told that he could never ride again either. So they had a lot of triumphs, but they had a lot of tragedies.
How important is this weekend, or how much do you enjoy what leads up to the weekend that is the Kentucky Derby?
Well, I wish I was there. It's the emotion and the color of the pageantry and the history of the sport all come together in the Kentucky Derby. It's the #1 race in the world. It's not the richest race in the world, but it's certainly the most prestigious race in the world.
How much time do you spend leading up to that, researching the horses and learning about the histories of each of the people that are in it?
Lots, quite a bit. I've been doing that for a long time. I really like handicapping the races, and I've tried to handicap this year's Kentucky Derby. It's a tough one. Forte is the favorite, but there's a horse called Angel of Emotion that I think, Angel of Empire, sorry, that I think is going to be really tough. He won the Arkansas Derby.
If it ends up being a muddy track, does that change what you're thinking?
Probably change everything, yeah. Is it, I haven't even looked, is it forecast for rain?
That's the story we've been hearing during the week, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that would make a difference because often when it's sloppy, the horse that gets to the top will be able to carry its speed farther because the other horses get the slop kicked back into their faces and obviously don't like that. So it could be a speed horse that wins the Derby if it comes up sloppy.
You know, you mentioned the pageantry and wishing you were there at the Derby. You're somebody that's covered Super Bowls, the Masters, the British Open. Talk to us about the pageantry and how special it is at the Derby, at some of these huge races that horse racing has.
Well, it celebrates history. The Derby has 149 years of it this year. Most of the great horses that you associate with horse racing all either ran in the Derby or won the Derby. It's the race of the year.
Curtis, did I hear right that you're from Edmonton?
Yes.
All right. Well, I know it's Kentucky Derby weekend, but I gotta ask, what is it like for we don't know much about Edmonton down in the United States,
right,
other than the Wayne Gretzky era. So I know this is a horse racing interview, but I gotta ask, how excited are you about your Edmonton Oilers?
Well, pretty excited. Their defense is pretty shaky, though. They've had a number of problems with a couple of their defensemen who are not doing their jobs, and their goalie can be a little shaky, too. So they have all the firepower with McDavid and Draisaitl, but they're having problems defensively.
We are jealous.
Yeah, that is a fun series to watch out there, and we talked in depth about the Flyers last week, and it's a much sadder story on our end with hockey now than it is on yours.
Yeah.
Curtis, where can people find the book if they'd like to go? Which, if you're not a horse racing fan, it's still a compelling story that people would want to read. You don't have to love horses or love the races to love this book.
Yeah, it's got horse racing as its background, of course, and its theme, but it's a story about a family in New Brunswick and 5 of them becoming jockeys, but everything that they went through to get there. The book is available in most bookstores. It's available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And Amazon is probably the easiest way to get a hold of one.
The book is The Turcottes, The Remarkable Story of a Horse Racing Dynasty. Curtis, best of luck with the book, and look forward to seeing how your handicapping shakes out tomorrow in the big race.
Okay, well, thanks, Jason and Jeffrey. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the time.